All right, welcome back to US History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. We're continuing to move through time, getting into the years of President Bush, specifically the 1990s. So we're going to describe kind of the transition of Ronald Reagan to Bush and compare and contrast their policies. We're going to explain the causes and results of the Persian Gulf War and discuss the events that constituted the end of the Cold War. We're finally going to get to the end of the Cold War. So remember, Ronald Reagan's vision for America was to revive the economy and reduce the federal government's size. He was a committed Cold War warrior who viewed the Soviet Union as a threat to American interests and famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He believed that the United States needed to demonstrate its willingness to act militarily on the world stage. In 1983, Reagan sent American soldiers to Lebanon as a part of a multinational peacekeeping force. But a devastating truck bomb destroyed the U.S. Marine barracks at the Beirut airport. The bombing also killed French soldiers who were part of this multinational force, and the tragedy demonstrated the dangers of military intervention in the Middle East. So by 1984, he withdrew the troops from Lebanon. Just 2 days after this bombing, the president authorized the invasion of Grenada, which is a small Caribbean island nation that had fallen under communist control. Cuba had stationed troops and technical workers on the island to support the new regime, and the U.S. military swiftly seized control. Cuban soldiers surrendered after just 2 days, and the invasion showed Reagan's determination to prevent communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere, even though he had just pulled troops out of the Middle East. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail about this, but I will just say that the conflict of the Cold War continued through Reagan's presidency in various regions, including Central America, the Middle East, various islands. This sort of battle between the communist and the democratic sides and the various supporters continued. We're going to skip over that scandal for today, and we're going to move on to things that are happening at home. We've got a lot to cover. So while cutting the federal budget at home, President Reagan dramatically increased military spending. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was nicknamed Star Wars, and the program aimed to create a defensive shield against Soviet missile attacks, using advanced technology to detect and destroy incoming missiles. Scientists argued that much of the needed technology didn't exist yet, and critics worried that the plan would violate treaties with the Soviet Union. So the system was never built, and the program cost $7.5 billion before being abandoned. And then the press highlighted wasteful military spending, including $640 toilet seats and $7,400 coffee machines. So kind of highlighting the quote-unquote military spending that wasn't military spending. Okay, so this is where we start to see the shift of the Cold War. After Reagan is reelected in 1984, he starts to moderate his stance toward the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has a new leader, Gorbachev, who is willing to negotiate. Gorbachev wanted to avoid another expensive arms race with the United States. The Soviet war in Afghanistan had drained Soviet resources and money, and so Gorbachev introduces reforms to improve Soviet society. So the president of the United States, Reagan, and Gorbachev meet in Geneva to discuss reducing nuclear weapons, and then they meet again in Iceland to discuss eliminating nuclear weapons. And by 1987, they signed something called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty at the White House, which is going to lead us to the end of the Cold War. So part of it was the president stepping back on like his aggressive anti-communist policies, and the other part of it was a new Soviet Union leader who wanted to bring the Soviet Union into the future and out with the Cold War. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell as peaceful protesters tore it down, which divided East and West Berlin, and this event symbolized the beginning of the end of communist governments in Eastern Europe. Revolutions swept across countries like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and they were mostly peaceful revolutions, and communist governments collapsed. The Soviet Union did not use military force to stop these changes, showing its weakness. And George H. Bush, Reagan's vice president, becomes president in 1989. He maintains good relations with Gorbachev and doesn't gloat about the Soviet collapse. And in 1991, Bush and Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. And by December of 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolves and essentially collapses, which marks the end of the decades-long Cold War. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about other changes in the 1980s. 1980s saw increased visibility of African Americans in mainstream culture and TV. We see a black anchor, the first black anchor on a television network, the first black winner of the Miss American pageant, the beginning of Oprah Winfrey's talk show addressing difficult social topics, MTV featuring R&B and hip hop acts reaching audiences of all backgrounds, the Color Purple novel winning the Pulitzer Prize and becoming widely read. However, the inequality, the economic inequality, continued to increase during the Reagan years. And unemployment rates for black people were almost twice as high as for white people. So they experienced both like forward movement and back movement in the 1980s. All right, let's see. We're gonna focus on George W. Bush winning the 1988 election. So George H.W. Bush, because there's two George Bushes. George Bush the senior is the one we're talking about today. His son also eventually becomes president. But George Bush runs on a promise to continue Reagan's economic policies and keep taxes low. He's of the same political party, and at the Republican convention, he made a famous pledge that said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." This was very popular among people. He won the election and became the 41st president of the United States, but he inherited a lot of economic problems from Reagan's policies. And during Reagan's 8 years as president, the federal budget debt tripled, so he inherited that as well. So he was pretty constrained by his no new taxes pledge. Taxes is one of the ways to generate revenue to get out of debt. Congress was controlled by Democrats who wanted to raise taxes on the wealthy, so he had opposition from the Congress. And so in October of 1990, the president and Congress reached a compromise budget agreement, which cut spending but raised taxes. This broke the president's no new taxes pledge and hurt his popularity. But he had to do what he believed was best for the economy that he had inherited. Bush promoted a domestic agenda based on, quote, 1,000 points of light. So his domestic agenda or his goals for at home relied on volunteers and community organizations, getting the people involved in helping make the country a better place. Internationally, he faced his first international crisis with the Gulf War. In August of 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded the oil-rich area of Kuwait, and the president faced his first international crisis. He built an unprecedented or unheard of international coalition of 34 countries to oppose Iraq. Operation Desert Shield was a move that deployed 500,000 American troops to the region, and Congress authorized the use of military force in 1991. So then Operation Desert Storm began with a campaign with the goal of getting the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. The general at the time argued against continuing to attack a defeated army after the initial wave, so the president agreed and withdrew troops, even though Saddam Hussein remained in power. This war showed that the United States had overcome what was referred to as the Vietnam syndrome, kind of staying involved longer than necessary. So he intervened and then he pulled back, which was generally approved upon decision. So we'll talk a little bit more about Bush as we move forward in time. And there's a lot going on in this time period, right? So again, we don't cover everything in lecture. You can dive deeper into your textbook or documentaries if you're interested in George H.W. Bush's presidency and more specifics. But we're going to continue to move through the 1990s.